Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the structural mechanics of why standard corporate governance actually breaks organizations. We're going to completely deconstruct how we think about risk, process, and accountability, and look at the exact mechanisms that cause organizational execution to just grind to an absolute halt.
So let's kick things off with a direct contradiction to conventional management wisdom. Standard advice tells us that to increase safety and reduce risk, you absolutely must add layers of oversight, committee approvals, and review gates, right? Well, we're arguing the exact opposite. Adding oversight and performative administrative approvals actively degrades organizational safety. It outright destroys actual accountability. It creates this cozy illusion of control while manufacturing structural blindness. Notice the non-obvious distinction we're drawing here between two totally different concepts, risk review and risk ownership. Why does oversight degrade safety? Well, here is the causal mechanism. Middle management layers absorb the intense pressure of decision-making by diluting it through process. When a committee merely reviews a risk, they opine, they ask for more data, they generate meeting minutes, but they don't actually execute. By giving committees veto power, the system effectively strips real-time risk ownership right out of the hands of the frontline operators. And those are the very people who actually possess the situational context needed to manage the risk. Part 1, Anatomy of Compliance Theater. Let's isolate the first primary pathogen in the system that causes execution to stall. We call this specific failure mode compliance theater. It happens when an organization decides to prioritize defensibility over correctness. It substitutes the mere appearance of control, think completed checklists, massive documentation trails, endless approval cascades, for actual structural integrity. The system values the map way more than the territory. It lets leadership feel secure just because the dashboard lights are all green, completely ignoring the fact that those lights aren't actually wired to the engine. And that triggers our next named failure mechanism. Strategic answer latency. Because the corporate system heavily punishes action that leads to failure, but rarely ever punishes inaction, managers logically use endless performative reviews as a shield against personal accountability. This creates a compounding structural delay. The organization develops this massive thinking delay, where decisions just get compressed and stuck in the middle layers of management. This latency actively harms the firm by making it entirely unresponsive to environmental volatility. The inevitable consequence of all this latency, the emergence of a shadow organization. The causal mechanism here is fascinating. When a rigid theatrical approval process makes official work structurally impossible to execute fast enough to meet market demands, what happens? Operators don't just give up. No, they invent unsanctioned workarounds. They bypass official channels entirely just to get the job done. This creates a totally unmanaged, invisible operational reality that functions completely outside the view of leadership. Part 2, the normalization of deviance. This creation of shadow operations leads us directly into a catastrophic failure mechanism. Sociologist Diane Vaughan absolutely hit the nail on the head with her concept of the normalization of deviance. It perfectly explains why these dangerous shadow organizations persist. Because these risky, unsanctioned deviations actually allow work to get done in an impossibly high-friction environment, they're quietly rewarded or, at the very least, tolerated by leadership. The deviation is seen as a clever workaround to bureaucratic friction rather than what it actually is, a fatal structural flaw. The causal mechanism is clear, and it is entirely structural. The theater of compliance effectively masks a massive accumulation of vulnerability. Because a catastrophic failure doesn't happen right away, the boundary defining acceptable behavior just incrementally widens. It creates this long, silent incubation period where highly deviant, undocumented behavior hardens into the new standard operating procedure. So when failure finally hits, it looks sudden, but structurally, it was inevitable. Part 3, systems instead of surveillance. Let's shift gears and look at the structural logic of high-reliability organizations to see how we actually cured this pathology. We have to recognize that execution failures are upstream of individual effort. Here's another crucial, non-obvious distinction we need to draw: systems versus surveillance. The deeply flawed mental model of traditional management assumes that accountability requires surveillance. It assumes that if you aren't directly hovering over someone or forcing them to beg for permission, they aren't accountable. But real accountability is a function of clear system design, not constant line-of-sight micromanagement. Surveillance just creates dependency and bottlenecks. Systems create true, scalable accountability. To eliminate the need for surveillance, you install a structural accountability framework. We're talking about specific structural mechanisms here. Explicit decision rights, workflows where security is embedded by default, naming a single dedicated owner for every outcome, and building a rigorous operating rhythm. These completely replace micromanagement. By deploying these structures, you're shifting decision-making authority directly to the operational node with the absolute best real-time knowledge of the situation. Part 4. Implementing governed activation. Let's look at exactly how to operationalize this massive shift in authority. This transition means moving away from a permission-based model to what we call governed activation. A permission-based model defaults to blocking. It assumes every single action requires a manual, human review, which just spins up a massive hidden factory of rework and delay. Governed activation defaults to execution. It completely eliminates approval bottlenecks by giving operators the full authority to move freely and autonomously, as long as they stay within explicitly defined boundaries. Here is exactly how you build this using concrete conditional decision rules. First, if an observable condition falls within the predefined guardrails, the operator must execute instantly without seeking human review. Second, if an observable condition breaches a defined threshold, the system routes the decision directly to a single named risk owner, bypassing committees entirely. Third, if a compliance control requires a separate manual action to complete, you redesign the process to embed that control directly into the default workflow so it literally cannot be bypassed. You make the secure path the path of least resistance. To govern these rules, you use an explicit decision matrix. It defines precisely who recommends, who approves, and who executes at every single layer, strategic, tactical, and operational. It ensures that when you delegate, you are transferring actual ownership and real decision rights, not just tossing tasks into a bureaucratic void. When you strip away the ambiguity, speed is instantly restored. Part 5. The fiduciary duty of speed. This brings us to the final structural requirement for organizational integrity. Think about the economics of delay. When compliance processes completely ignore the opportunity cost of their own friction, capital gets trapped. It creates this massive latency tax that fundamentally destroys value. Basically, if the economic cost of delaying a decision exceeds the total value of the risk you're supposedly mitigating, your process is structurally insolvent. You're paying a heavy premium for a performance of safety that is actively harming the firm. We absolutely have to embrace this counterintuitive reality. Speed is a safety feature. True organizational safety does not come from performative committees or endless documentation. It comes from rigorous structural integrity and data-driven guardrails. Look, an organization that moves slower than its surrounding environment is an organization that is structurally failing. Speed, when governed by intelligent systems, is the ultimate defense against volatility. I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. I want you to examine the operational drag inside your own walls. Look really closely at your approval layers and review gates and ask yourself a hard question. Are your compliance rituals actually protecting your business from material risk, or are they merely protecting your leadership's comfort with inaction? Are you really willing to dismantle performative theater and replace it with the intense structural integrity required for true autonomous execution? Something to think about.